In 1532, a Spanish notary named Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo writes a report for the Spanish crown. He has been observing the encomienda system in the Caribbean for 2 decades. The encomienda grants Spanish colonists control over indigenous populations. The colonists are supposed to protect and Christianize the natives. In exchange, the natives provide labor. On paper, it is a reciprocal arrangement. In practice, Oviedo writes, it is slavery, and it is killing everyone. The indigenous population of Hispaniola, the island where Columbus first landed, was estimated at 400,000 in 1492. By 1514, it had fallen to 26,000. By 1542, fewer than 500 remained. Similar collapses occurred across the Caribbean and into Central and South America. Entire civilizations disappeared within a generation. Disease was part of it. Smallpox, measles, typhus, illnesses the natives had no immunity to, swept through populations. But disease alone does not explain the scale of the collapse. The other factor was labor extraction so brutal that it killed faster than populations could reproduce. The encomienda system was designed to solve a problem. Spain had conquered vast territories, but lacked the population to settle them. Spaniards who traveled to the New World wanted wealth, not to farm or mine themselves. They needed labor. The indigenous populations were there, numerous and at first cooperative. The encomienda formalized this. A colonist was granted an encomienda, a group of natives, usually from a specific village or region. Those natives owed the colonist labor. In return, the colonist owed them protection and religious instruction. But there was no enforcement mechanism for the colonists' obligations, and there was immediate demand for the natives' labor. Gold had been discovered. Silver would be found later. Sugar plantations were being established. All of it required workers. The colonists drove the natives as hard as possible. 16-hour days in mines. Fieldwork in tropical heat without adequate food or rest. Punishments for slowness or resistance. Women and children were not exempt. Everyone worked. The mortality rate was staggering. Natives died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and despair. They died in mine collapses. They died from infected wounds. They died from diseases that spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of forced labor camps. And when they died, the colonists simply requested more natives from neighboring regions. The system treated people as renewable resources. When one group was depleted, another was brought in. Spanish authorities were aware of the problem. Reports reached the crown regularly. Priests, particularly Dominican friars like Bartolomé de las Casas, documented the atrocities and lobbied for reform. Las Casas wrote extensively about the horrors he witnessed. Natives being worked to death, families torn apart, villages emptied. He argued that the encomienda was morally indefensible and economically unsustainable because it was killing the labor force it depended on. The crown responded with laws. The laws of Burgos in 1512 attempted to regulate the encomienda, limiting work hours and requiring colonists to provide food and shelter. The new laws of 1542 went further, abolishing the encomienda outright and forbidding the enslavement of natives. But the laws were unenforceable. Spain was thousands of miles away. Communication was slow. The colonists, who depended on native labor for their wealth, ignored the laws. And local officials, who were often colonists themselves, or beholden to colonists, did not enforce them. When the crown sent officials to impose the new laws, colonists revolted. In Peru, the viceroy sent to enforce the reforms was killed by encomenderos. In Mexico, colonists threatened rebellion if the laws were implemented. The crown, facing the possibility of losing the colonies entirely, backed down. The new laws were suspended. The encomienda continued, and the dying continued. The economic logic was brutal but clear. The colonists were maximizing short-term extraction. A native worked to death in 5 years generated more gold or sugar than a native who lived for 20 but worked less intensely. The long-term sustainability of the labor force was irrelevant because individual colonists did not bear the cost of depletion. When their natives died, they could request more. The cost was externalized to the indigenous population and to future colonists who would find fewer workers available. But by then, the original encomenderos had already made their fortunes. This is the logic of extractive institutions. When those who control resources do not bear the full cost of depletion, they overexploit. The tragedy of the commons in reverse. Not too many people using a shared resource, but a few people with power using a resource, human labor, until it collapses. And because the power is concentrated and the costs are dispersed, there is no mechanism to stop the extraction until nothing is left. The Spanish tried to solve the labor shortage by importing African slaves. If the indigenous population was collapsing, another source of labor could replace it. The transatlantic slave trade, which had been small-scale before, expanded rapidly in the mid-16th century. Africans were brought to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to the Spanish Main. They were forced into the same mines and plantations that had killed the natives, and they died at similar rates. The conditions on sugar plantations were especially deadly. Sugar cultivation required intense labor: planting, harvesting, processing. The work was done in extreme heat. The mills where cane was crushed were dangerous. Workers lost fingers, hands, arms in the machinery. The boiling houses where juice was reduced to sugar were infernos. Slaves worked 18-hour days during harvest season. Life expectancy on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean was often less than 7 years after arrival. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work slaves to death and buy new ones than to maintain them in conditions that would allow them to survive long term. This was explicit. Account books from plantations show the math: the cost of a slave, the expected output, the expected lifespan, profit margin. It was a business decision. Humans were capital assets, depreciated over time, replaced when depleted. System was not accidental brutality, it was rational brutality. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Indigenous population of the Americas never recovered. Estimates suggest that 90% of the pre-Columbian population died within a century of contact. Some of this was disease, but the labor systems imposed by European colonizers accelerated the collapse. Populations that might have survived epidemics with time to recover were instead worked to death while weakened by illness. In Africa, the slave trade depopulated entire regions. Millions were taken. Millions more died in wars fought to capture slaves or in famines caused by the collapse of agricultural societies. The economic and social structures of West and Central Africa were shattered. The effects persisted for centuries. The regions that supplied slaves remained underdeveloped because their populations had been extracted as a resource. The profits from this extraction flowed to Europe. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, all produced by forced labor, became the foundation of European wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries. British ports like Bristol and Liverpool grew rich on the slave trade. French sugar from Haiti was the most profitable colony in the world. The wealth built from slavery financed industrialization. Factories in Manchester were built with profits from cotton picked by slaves in the American South. Banks in London were capitalized with sugar money from the Caribbean. But the societies that did the extracting were also warped by it. Slavery created economies dependent on coercion. In the American South, the entire social and political structure was organized around maintaining slavery. Laws, culture, religion, all were bent to justify and enforce the system. And when slavery was finally abolished in 1865, the South had no economic model to replace it. The region remained poor for a century because it had built nothing except extraction. Extractive systems also corrupt governance. In colonies where labor was coerced, there was no incentive to build institutions that protected rights or encouraged development. The state existed to enforce extraction. Courts protected property and slaves, not justice. Police suppressed resistance, not crime. The institutions that did develop were predatory, designed to extract, not to serve. And those institutions persisted long after the labor systems that created them were abolished. Latin America provides the clearest example. The encomienda was eventually replaced by the hacienda system, which was serfdom in all but name. Indigenous and mixed-race workers were bound to large estates, forced to work for minimal wages, kept in perpetual debt to the landowner. The hacienda system persisted into the 20th century in some regions, and the societies it created were profoundly unequal. A small elite controlled land and wealth. The majority lived in poverty. Political power was concentrated. Democracy was weak or non-existent. These are not coincidences. They're the legacy of extractive institutions. Systems built on coercion do not transition smoothly to systems built on consent. The elites who benefited from extraction resist change because change threatens their wealth and power. And the institutions, the laws, the courts, the police, were designed to protect extraction. Reforming them requires dismantling the structures that define the society. Few societies manage this without revolution or collapse. The economic effects also persist. Regions that were subjected to extractive institutions are, on average, poorer today than regions that were not. The correlation is stark. Africa, colonized and depopulated by slavery. Latin America, conquered and exploited through forced labor. Both remain less developed than Europe and North America. The initial extraction drained wealth and people. The institutions that were built to facilitate extraction became barriers to development, and the gap, created centuries ago, has never closed. Some argue that colonialism brought benefits: infrastructure, technology, institutions. But the infrastructure was built to extract resources, not to develop the colony. Railroads connected mines to ports, not cities to each other. Institutions served colonial administration, not local populations. And the technology transferred was the minimum necessary to maintain extraction. When colonies gained independence, words, they inherited economies designed to serve foreign interests, not their own. There is also the question of what was destroyed. The Aztec Empire had a population estimated at 5 to 6 million. The Inca Empire, 10 to 12 million. Both had complex societies, advanced agriculture, monumental architecture. They were not primitive. They were civilizations, and they were annihilated. Not just conquered, but erased. The knowledge, the culture, the systems that had taken centuries to develop, all were lost. The destruction was not just demographic. It was civilizational. The same happened in Africa. The societies that existed before the slave trade were diverse and complex. Kingdoms, trade networks, universities. Timbuktu was a center of learning. The Kingdom of Congo had relations with European powers as an equal, but the slave trade destabilized everything. Kings who resisted were overthrown. Societies that refused to participate were invaded. By the 19th century, when Europeans colonized Africa, formally, the continent had already been devastated by centuries of extraction. Colonialism was not the beginning of Africa's exploitation. It was the continuation. The question is whether development could have occurred differently. Could the Americas have been integrated into global trade without the encomienda and slavery? Could Africa have developed without the slave trade? The answer is unknowable. But the trajectory that did occur was not inevitable. It was chosen. By colonists who wanted wealth fast. By governments that prioritized revenue from colonies over the welfare of colonized peoples. By economic systems that treated humans as commodities. The long-term costs were ignored because they were borne by others. The colonists extracted and left. Empires profited and declined. And the societies that were exploited are still recovering, if recovery is even the right word. Some wounds do not heal. Some losses cannot be replaced. The populations that were destroyed are gone. The civilizations that were erased do not return. What remains is absence and poverty. And the institutions built to enforce extraction, which persist because dismantling them requires power that the exploited do not have. Extractive institutions also teach a lesson about sustainability. Systems that maximize short-term extraction collapse. The encomienda collapsed because it killed the labor force. The hacienda system collapsed because it could not compete with economies that invested in productivity rather than coercion. Slavery ended not because of morality alone, but because industrial economies that paid workers were more productive than agricultural economies that enslaved them. The long-term logic favors development over extraction, but the short-term profits from extraction are so large that those with power choose extraction anyway. And by the time the system collapses, they have already moved on. This dynamic appears everywhere. Companies that clear-cut forests for timber profit in the short term. When the forests are gone, they move to new forests. Mining companies that exhaust deposits profit and leave. When the mine is depleted, they abandon the town. The cost of depletion is borne by those who remain. And those who remain have no power to stop the extraction because the extractors control the law, the police, and the economy. The pattern is identical to the encomienda. Extraction until depletion. Profit for the few. Collapse for the many. Modern extractive institutions are less overtly violent. Workers are not whipped. Debt and dependence replace chains. But the logic is the same. Maximize output. Minimize cost. Externalize depletion. The difference is that modern systems are more durable because they are more subtle. A worker trapped by debt, unable to leave a job because they need health insurance or cannot afford to miss a paycheck, is constrained as surely as a slave, just without visible chains. The extraction is slower, but it is extraction nonetheless. The legacy of the encomienda is not just historical, it is structural. Societies built on extraction inherited institutions designed for extraction. Those institutions evolved, but their purpose remained: to concentrate wealth, to suppress resistance, to externalize costs. And because those institutions are embedded in law, culture, and economics, changing them requires dismantling the entire structure, which is why 500 years after the encomienda, the countries that were colonized remain, on average, poorer, more unequal, and less stable than the countries that did the colonizing. A village in Hispaniola, 1520. The huts are empty. The fields are untended. Bodies lie where they fell. Spanish colonist walks through, counting the survivors. There are 12. He writes a letter to the governor, requesting a new grant of natives. The old ones are gone. He needs workers for his mine. The governor approves the request. Natives from another village are transferred. They arrive in chains. They are put to work. Within 5 years, they too will be gone, and the colonists will request more. The system does not stop. It just moves to the next village, the next, till there are no villages left.